$15 billion. That's how much Honda just burned. Not in a scandal, not in a recall, but in one of the most catastrophic business blunders in automotive history. A company that survived wars, recessions, and decades of competition just made a bet so monumentally wrong that it's triggering soul searching from former executives, who are now openly questioning their CEO's grip on reality. Let me walk you through what happened, because this isn't just a story about one company's failure. This is a masterclass in how even the most legendary institutions can completely self-destruct when leadership becomes detached from reality and starts chasing fantasies instead of building on genuine strengths. Honda Motor Company. For over 70 years, this Japanese automotive giant has been synonymous with reliability, engineering excellence, and smart business decisions. They survived when others failed. They adapted when markets shifted. They were the company that popularized hybrid vehicles back when everyone else was still obsessed with gas engines and thought the idea of a battery-powered motor was nothing more than a fantasy. Honda wasn't a follower. Honda was a leader. They set trends. They didn't chase them. In 2026, Honda did something that should have been impossible, something that would have seemed unthinkable just 5 years earlier. They posted their first annual loss since becoming a publicly traded company in 1957. Let that sink in for a moment. 70 years. 7 decades of consistent profitability, through economic booms and busts, through oil crises and recessions, through competition with every major automaker on the planet, all wiped out in a single year. Not because of economic collapse, not because of a global pandemic, not because of some external force beyond their control, but because of one catastrophic strategic decision that went so wrong, so spectacularly wrong, that the company lost billions of dollars they'll never get back. The numbers are absolutely staggering when you really stop and think about them. Honda's auto division recorded over 400 billion yen in losses in fiscal 2025. That's $2.55 billion just in operating losses, gone in a single fiscal year. But here's where it gets worse. When you add in all the restructuring costs, the scrapped projects, the canceled vehicles, the facilities that were built for products that would never see the light of day, and the write-downs on technology that represents years of research and development that will now sit in filing cabinets gathering dust, the total bill reaches 2.5 trillion yen. That's $15.7 billion. An almost incomprehensible amount of money, completely evaporated. This happened because Honda made a decision that seemed absolutely brilliant 5 years ago. They looked at the automotive industry and they decided to go all in on electric vehicles. Completely all in. They looked at the market trends. They saw Tesla's meteoric rise from a tiny startup to a trillion-dollar company. They watched as governments around the world began enthusiastically talking about banning gas-powered cars by 2035 or 2040. And they thought, we need to be a major part of this future. We need to be leaders in this new world. On paper, it made perfect sense. Honda had the capital to invest. They had world-class engineering talent who could design anything. They had the manufacturing facilities and supply chain relationships. They had a trusted brand that stretched across the globe. They had a reputation for quality and reliability that was envied by competitors. What could possibly go wrong? They had every advantage you could imagine, except they had one fatal flaw. They didn't truly understand the market dynamics they were entering, and they were too proud or too arrogant to admit it when the evidence started becoming clear. Between 2020 and 2026, Honda invested absolutely enormous sums of money into developing an entirely new lineup of electric vehicles. Not hybrids, which they were famous for, not plug-in hybrids, which offered a practical bridge solution. Full electric vehicles, designed and engineered to compete directly and head-to-head with Tesla and the emerging Chinese EV manufacturers who were already eating the market alive with their lower prices and more agile manufacturing approaches. They canceled 3 major models that were supposed to launch in North America in 2027 and 2028. These weren't minor projects or experimental concepts. These were flagship vehicles that represented Honda's entire future vision in the North American market. They pulled the plug on their Prologue crossover after just 2 years on the market, essentially telling early adopters that their decision to buy a Honda Prologue was a mistake. They essentially admitted to the world in a quiet corporate way that their EV strategy was completely dead on arrival. It never had a chance. The company had been chasing a dream that couldn't possibly work. But here's the thing that makes this truly devastating and particularly painful to watch unfold. Honda didn't just lose money on failed products. That's bad enough. But they also lost their way. They abandoned the one thing, the single core competency, that actually made them special and different from every other automaker in the world. Hybrids, the revolutionary technology that Honda pioneered and perfected. The innovation that they had spent decades perfecting. The technology that should have been their superweapon, their secret sauce, their competitive advantage in the transition to electric mobility. Instead, they chased Tesla's dream so desperately, so single-mindedly that they forgot to be Honda anymore. They stopped listening to their own voice. They stopped trusting their own instincts. They became just another automaker trying to copy Tesla, and they did it worse than everyone else. In March of 2026, Honda made their first big and very public announcement about the restructuring. The company was canceling 3 flagship electric vehicle models. These weren't minor projects or secondary developments. These were centerpieces of Honda's entire future vision. They were supposed to be the next generation of their EV lineup. They were the Prologue successor. They were the vehicles that Honda was counting on to transform their image from a maker of reliable, practical family cars into a serious player in the EV revolution. They were going to prove that Honda could compete with Tesla and the Chinese manufacturers. When the announcement dropped, shock reverberated through the industry and financial markets. Investors who had supported Honda's pivot to electric vehicles suddenly started asking very difficult and very uncomfortable questions. Questions like, how did you possibly get this so wrong? And what were you thinking when you made these decisions? And most importantly, who's running this company and why are they making such terrible choices? At first, Honda tried to explain it away using conventional industry talking points. They blamed cooling EV demand. They blamed rising interest rates, making expensive vehicles less affordable for consumers. They blamed consumers' anxiety about charging infrastructure and range anxiety. There was some truth to all of this. The euphoria around electric vehicles that had gripped the market in 2020 and 2021 was definitely fading by 2025 and 2026. The EV winter was very real. Demand for $50,000 and higher price point electric cars was slowing down across the entire industry, not just for Honda. But here's what Honda wasn't saying publicly. Here's what they were finally forced to admit behind closed doors. They couldn't compete. Not on price, not on manufacturing efficiency, not on technology, not on anything that mattered. They looked at Tesla's innovative, unboxed manufacturing process, which allowed Tesla to build cars faster and cheaper than almost anyone else in the world. They looked at the Chinese EV manufacturers like BYD and Xiaomi and others who were taking over entire markets in Asia with agile, low-cost production methods and better understanding of consumer preferences. And they came to a realization that terrified them. Honda didn't have the capabilities to compete with these players in the EV space. They were too slow, too expensive, and too set in their ways. This is where the story becomes really interesting and really messy, because it shows the internal political chaos that was happening inside the company. When the announcement of the cancellations came down from executive leadership, it triggered something completely unexpected. Former Honda executives started talking, and they weren't just making polite comments about the decision. They were angry. They were deeply critical. They weren't happy. Retired executives, people who had built Honda into what it was during their tenure, began holding secret meetings in late 2025 to discuss what they saw as catastrophic failures of leadership. These weren't just casual conversations over coffee or lunch. These were serious, formal strategy sessions where some of Honda's most respected former leaders, people with decades of experience and deep institutional knowledge, were discussing what they believed were fundamental problems with the direction that current CEO Toshihiro Mibe was taking the company. These former executives felt that under Mibe's leadership, Honda was being run based on panic and wishful thinking rather than on sound strategic analysis. They watched as billions of dollars were committed to a strategy that seemed increasingly unrealistic. They saw opportunities in other markets being squandered. They felt that the company was losing its soul, losing the discipline and the clear-headed thinking that had made Honda successful for so long. One of the most damning moments in this internal corporate drama came when Nobuhiko Kawamoto, a legendary former CEO of Honda who had guided the company through some of its most successful periods, actually sat down with Mibe in April of 2026. This wasn't a casual meeting. This was a former leader going to the current leader and essentially telling him that he needed to step down, that his leadership was causing catastrophic damage to the company, that he had lost the confidence of people who knew Honda inside and out. Reuters reported this conversation. Here you had a titan of the company, someone who had led Honda through its most profitable and successful periods, essentially saying that the current leadership was in completely over their head. That's not normal. That doesn't happen in most companies. When something like this becomes public, it means the internal situation has deteriorated dramatically. The criticisms from these former executives weren't just about the money, though the $15 billion was certainly catastrophic and impossible to ignore. The real issue, according to these insiders who had been at Honda's highest levels, was strategic blindness. They said Mibe had dropped the ball in China. This isn't a small market we're talking about. China is the biggest car market on the planet, the single largest automotive market in the world. While Honda was wasting billions on a doomed EV strategy in North America, trying to compete with Tesla, they were losing ground in China to Chinese manufacturers who understood the market better, who could execute faster, who could build cheaper, and who were willing to innovate in ways that traditional automakers weren't. The former executives also pointed to what they called a loss of Genba roots. This is a Japanese business concept that essentially means losing touch with the ground level, hands-on reality of your business. They felt that Honda's current leadership had become disconnected from what was actually happening on the ground. They were making decisions based on projections and hopes and wishful thinking, rather than on the real needs of real customers. They were listening to consultants and analysts and futuristic predictions, rather than listening to the people who actually sold cars and the people who actually bought them. Think about this from a customer perspective for a moment. If you were someone who made the decision to buy a Honda Prologue in 2023 or 2024, you were making a statement. You were saying, I believe in Honda's vision for the future. I believe in electric vehicles. I believe this company understands where the industry is going. I believe this company is going to be a leader in the EV revolution. You were putting your money and your trust into that belief. 2 years later, Honda discontinued the car. The company essentially told you that their vision was wrong. Your vehicle wasn't going to be part of some grand automotive future. It was just a casualty of a failed strategy. You were a victim of Honda's mismanagement. This wasn't just an isolated model discontinuation either. Honda had been aggressively pushing multiple electric vehicles. The Prologue was their flagship, their American Idol, so to speak. It was the vehicle that was supposed to prove that Honda could build compelling electric cars that customers would actually want to buy. When it got axed after just 2 years of production, it sent a massive signal to the market. Honda wasn't confident in their products. Honda didn't believe in their own vision anymore. If Honda didn't believe, why should customers? The irony of this entire situation is almost painful to contemplate when you really think about it. Honda is the company that invented the modern hybrid. They understood before almost anyone else that the automotive future wasn't going to be one thing or the other, but rather a blend of technologies adapted to different markets and different consumer needs and different regional regulations. Their hybrid technology was so good and so well engineered that even Toyota, their biggest competitor, basically copied the concept and built their own massive hybrid empire that now generates enormous profits. But somewhere along the way between 2020 and 2026, hybrid technology became unfashionable. It became unsexy. Wall Street wanted EV purity. Investment analysts wanted companies betting everything on electric vehicles. The media celebrated Tesla and other EV makers like they were the chosen ones who would transform transportation. Governments started talking enthusiastically about banning gas engines entirely by 2035 or 2040. And Honda, desperate to be part of the cool kids table, desperate to be seen as innovative and forward-thinking, abandoned the one thing that actually worked for them. They abandoned their core competency. Here's what makes this even more tragic and even more infuriating when you think about it. By the time Honda figured out they'd made a catastrophic mistake, it was already far too late. They couldn't just flip a switch and go back to hybrids. They'd already scaled back hybrid production to invest in EV development. They'd already told their engineering teams that the future was electric. They'd already made commitments to suppliers and manufacturers. They'd already spent the money. The investment had been made. When Honda finally announced their comeback plan in May of 2026 after the massive losses had been revealed, the plan consisted of essentially admitting defeat. The company announced they were developing 2 new hybrid vehicles that would launch by 2028. They admitted they were unable to deliver products that offered value for money better than what new EV manufacturers were providing. They essentially told the world that they'd been wrong, completely wrong. And now they were correcting course, going back to what they should have done all along. But here's the brutal reality about trying to recapture market position after you've made a massive strategic error of this magnitude. It's incredibly difficult. It's almost like trying to rebuild a house after you've burned it down. Customers have moved on. Competitors have filled the gap where Honda used to dominate. Investor confidence has been damaged. Your brand has been tarnished by the admission that you didn't know what you were doing. The financial damage was absolutely astronomical. Honda's stock declined about 6% over the course of a year, struggling to get back to the highs it had achieved in 2024. But that's just the stock price, a number on a screen that fluctuates daily. The real damage was in the billions of dollars written off as losses, the factories that were built for products that never got produced, the research and development facilities that were constructed and equipped and staffed for technologies that would never see commercial deployment, the engineering teams that spent years, in some cases nearly a decade, developing technologies and components that would never be used. And let's talk about what could have been, what was possible. Honda had the opportunity to lead the hybrid market into the future and beyond. And while Tesla was burning through cash to build gigafactories, while Chinese manufacturers were competing in cutthroat markets where profit margins were razor thin, while other traditional automakers were struggling to figure out their EV strategies, Honda could have been perfecting hybrid technology. They could have positioned hybrids as the intelligent middle ground, a technology that provided the benefits of electric propulsion and zero-emission driving in cities, without the range anxiety or infrastructure concerns that plagued pure EV adoption in rural areas or for long-distance drivers. Honda could have owned that market. They had the expertise. They had the manufacturing capability. They had customer trust. Instead, they chased someone else's vision and found out too late that they were running in completely the wrong direction. The great EV slowdown of 2025 and 2026 was something that industry analysts had predicted and forecasted, but Honda refused to see it coming or refused to believe it would happen. Consumer anxiety about charging infrastructure was very real and very persistent. Interest rates had risen significantly, making expensive vehicles less affordable for average consumers. The federal tax incentives that had been pushing consumers toward expensive electric vehicles were being reconsidered by governments as the costs became apparent. And somewhere in all of this, the EV bubble burst. The euphoria faded. The reality set in. We're not talking about the end of electric vehicles. That's not what happened. What happened was the end of EV euphoria. The end of the belief that electric vehicles would somehow immediately replace all gas-powered cars within a few years. The realization, finally, that the transition to electric transportation would be slower, messier, and more complicated than anyone had anticipated in their wildest optimistic dreams. But by the time this realization became clear to everyone, Honda had already burned through billions of dollars they didn't have to waste. They'd already canceled products. They'd already alienated customers who had believed in their vision. They'd already damaged their brand in ways that would take years to repair. And they'd already allowed competitors to move into the space where Honda could have dominated if they'd stayed true to themselves. The real tragedy here isn't just the money. Money can be recovered. Companies can rebuild from financial losses if they're willing to make the hard decisions and execute properly. The real tragedy is that Honda forgot to listen to its own voice. It forgot to trust its own instincts. The company had spent decades proving that they understood how to adapt to changing market conditions. They'd been the ones to pioneer hybrid technology when it seemed like nothing more than a novelty that nobody would actually buy. They'd survived the Japanese economic collapse of the 1990s that devastated many companies. They'd navigated the global financial crisis of 2008. They'd weathered multiple recall crises and complex supply chain disruptions. But when faced with the hype and hope and evangelism of the EV revolution, Honda lost its discipline. They stopped making decisions based on market reality and started making decisions based on wishful thinking and fear of being left behind. They looked at what was fashionable and trendy and exciting rather than what would actually work in the market and what customers actually needed. They listened to the cheerleaders and the futurists and the consultants instead of listening to their customers and listening to their own institutional knowledge. Now, as we look toward the future and what comes next, Honda faces a choice, a real choice. They can try to recover from this catastrophic error. They can rebuild their hybrid portfolio and reestablish themselves as the company that understands the complexity of the automotive transition. They can become leaders again instead of followers. Or they can continue down a path where they're always playing catch-up with Tesla and Chinese manufacturers, always trying to be something they're not, always chasing someone else's vision. The smart money says Honda will eventually recover because they have the fundamental strengths they need. They have substantial capital and deep financial resources. They have world-class engineering talent. They have a brand reputation that's built on 70 years of reliability. They have manufacturing expertise. They have supply chain relationships. But they'll never get back the years they lost. They'll never get back the billions of dollars they burned. And they'll never get back the opportunity they had to lead the market instead of following it. What happened to Honda is a crucial reminder that no company, no matter how legendary, is completely immune to catastrophic strategic mistakes. The factors that made Honda successful for decades, their conservatism, their focus on reliability, their respect for market realities, became the very things they abandoned when they decided to chase the EV dream like everyone else. The lesson here isn't that electric vehicles are bad or that Honda was wrong to explore them. The lesson is that every company has a core competency, a fundamental strength that defines who they are and what they do well. Honda's core competency was understanding how to build vehicles that were efficient, reliable, and offered real value to customers. Hybrids were the perfect expression of that strength. But Honda got seduced by the narrative of the future. They looked at Tesla's market capitalization, which was higher than Toyota and General Motors combined, and felt like they had to match it. They looked at government mandates about phasing out gas engines and panicked. They looked at the excitement around electric vehicles and wanted desperately to be part of it, to be seen as innovative. And in doing all of that, and pursuing all those goals, they forgot to be Honda. Now, in 2026, with $15 billion in losses behind them, with their CEO facing serious criticism from legendary former executives, with their stock underperforming the broader market, with dealerships struggling, Honda is learning an expensive lesson about the dangers of abandoning your core identity to chase someone else's dream. The question now is whether Honda will actually recover from this, or whether this represents the beginning of a longer, slower decline. History will tell us the answer eventually. But one thing is absolutely certain. The next time Honda makes a major strategic decision, they'll think very carefully about whether they're being true to what made them great, or whether they're just chasing the latest trend. $15 billion is an incredibly expensive way to learn that lesson. But if Honda can internalize this experience and return to their core strengths, they might just prove that even the most catastrophic mistakes don't have to be terminal. The question is whether they have the wisdom and the courage to actually make that change.